When a U.S. ambassador nominee can't even say the words, "No, that's not genocide," it's not just hesitation, it's revelation. This moment exposes how deep the politics of denial run inside Trump's circle, where racial fear gets dressed up as foreign policy.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bezell, in February of this year, President Trump made the legally and morally absurd claim that the government of South Africa was engaged in genocide against Afrikaners there. And if confirmed, you, of course, would be our ambassador to South Africa. So I have a pretty straightforward question. Do you agree that that claim was absurd?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. My answer to you is this. If you were to talk to those people who are involved, they fear—
Mr. Bezell, I'm sorry. Genocide is a legally defined issue. No. It's not a question of someone's impression. There's a legal definition for it. To your knowledge, has the State Department legal advisor concluded that the government of South Africa is engaged in genocide?
Senator, I don't know that answer, but Senator—
No, it's a straightforward question. I'm not going to. It's a straightforward question. There's a legal definition of genocide. I want to know if you agree that that's an absurd claim made by the President of the United States.
Senator, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't address it that way.
The President, of course, is reported to be engaged right now in reducing the number of refugees that can come into the United States to something around 7,500. And that the overwhelming majority of those would be Afrikaners, white South Africans. That, in my view, is a gross misuse of our policies. Do you agree that we should not have a refugee policy, admission policy, that's based on race?
Senator, in South Africa—
No, I'm asking you if we should have a refugee admission policy based on race. Again, it's a simple question, sir.
Senator, I'm trying to answer it.
Yes or no? Should we have one based on race?
In South Africa, you have thousands of attacks that have taken place against white farmers. They fear for their lives. What the president is saying is that they can come to the United States as refugees if they fear for their lives.
Right. So that's not an answer to my question. There is a legal criteria for people being admitted to the United States. My question was that based on reports, very credible reports, the Trump administration is talking about making it a cap worldwide of refugees and making almost all of them Afrikaners, white South Africans. I know you don't want to answer the question. That sounds like a race-based refugee
Senator, I
policy.
can't answer. I'm sorry, I can't answer the question. I'm not privy to that. I don't know the answer.
Do you agree?
I don't know the answer about
this.
camps.
This is a question. It's apart from South Africa. Do you believe we should have a race-based refugee admissions policy? Yes or no?
I believe that in South Africa—
No, that wasn't my question.
Afrikaners
You're going to be a
are
representative of the United States overseas if you're confirmed.
But
All
my
right,
focus,
let me go
Senator—
on. The whole issue of South Africa is not new to you. And back in the 1980s, I happened to be a staff member on this committee when this committee passed the comprehensive anti-apartheid legislation, sanctions against South Africa. As I look at your comments from that period, you were not supportive of that effort. Is that a fair characterization of your statement? I'm being very broad.
I'm not aware of what you did, Senator, but I can tell you what our position was as conservatives back in the 1980s. ANC and Nelson Mandela at that time were aligned with the Soviet Union, which was the biggest threat to peace in the world and the mortal enemy of the United States. As such, we were in opposition.
Okay.
I think, Senator, at the same time, it's an extraordinary evolution that 10 years later, approximately, when the wall came down and that association ended, so too did the relationship that the conservative movement had with Nelson Mandela. If I'm asked today, who do I think is the most revered person in South Africa? Who do I have the most respect for? It would be Nelson Mandela.
Okay, because you've criticized others for what you call sort of the glorification of Nelson Mandela, as you know. So it's interesting to hear that statement today. Let me just say in closing, I think at that time you worked with then Senator Jesse Helms to have a hearing that actually objected to the Reagan administration's decision to send an emissary to meet with the ANC. That was after this committee on a bipartisan basis, led by Senator Lugar, passed the sanctions bill. I think you probably were very strongly opposed to that bill, but in my view, that bill was one of the great things this committee did on a bipartisan basis, and that helped bring apartheid to an end. And people who oppose that have to live with the idea that there could still be an apartheid regime in South Africa today, but for that legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
What we just saw wasn't just a tense back and forth about policy. It was a moment that exposes the deeper moral and historical blind spots that still shape how America engages with the world, especially when it comes to race and justice. Senator Chris Van Hollen asked a simple, factual question. Is South Africa committing genocide against white Afrikaner farmers, as Donald Trump once claimed? That question had a clear legal answer: no. The State Department, international human rights groups, and South African civil society have all debunked that narrative for years. But when the nominee couldn't even say the word no, it said something profound about the political culture he represents. Trump's claim about white genocide wasn't an innocent mistake. It was rooted in the same disinformation ecosystem that fuels extremist and white nationalist talking points. It recasts the complex story of post-apartheid South Africa, where land reform and inequality remain huge issues, into a racial panic about victimized whites. It's a way to weaponize fear, to shift the conversation from historical justice to resentment. So when a nominee for ambassador repeats or refuses to reject that framing, he's not being neutral. He's amplifying a narrative that distorts reality and undermines both American credibility and South African democracy. Van Hollen was right to push back, because the stakes go far beyond one hearing. A U.S. ambassador isn't just a bureaucrat. He or she embodies what the country stands for abroad. If a nominee can't affirm that U.S. refugee policy should never be based on race, that should be disqualifying on principle alone. Yet what we heard instead was evasion, deflection, and a kind of moral fog that has become all too common. The idea that personal conscience is irrelevant, that all that matters is serving the president. That's the opposite of accountability. It's a dangerous mindset that erases responsibility for truth, for law, for human rights. Van Hollen also reminded us of a historical parallel many Americans forget. In the 1980s, the same conservative circles that now claim to defend freedom once opposed sanctions against apartheid South Africa. They labeled Nelson Mandela a communist and stood with the Reagan administration's policy of constructive engagement, a policy that effectively prolonged apartheid. That nominee, by his own admission, was part of that movement. Only after apartheid fell did he decide Mandela was the most revered man in South Africa. That evolution may sound redemptive, but it also underscores how easily moral clarity can bend to political convenience. This exchange forces us to ask harder questions. What does American diplomacy look like when moral truth becomes negotiable? What happens when history's lessons, from apartheid to civil rights, are rewritten to fit partisan loyalties? And how can a nation preach democracy abroad when its own representatives hesitate to condemn racial injustice in plain terms? That's what makes moments like this hearing so important. They aren't just political theater. They're a window into how power rationalizes itself. They remind us that silence and equivocation can be just as corrosive as outright prejudice. Because if officials can't say that race-based policies are wrong, if they can't even reject a baseless genocide myth, then the moral foundation of American leadership starts to crumble. At Left Lens, we unpack these moments not to score points, but to understand what they reveal about who we are and what we stand for. It's about context, conscience, and clarity. If you believe in truth-driven analysis that connects the dots between history and power, don't just watch, be part of it. Like this video, subscribe to Left Lens, and share it with someone who still believes diplomacy should be grounded in facts, not fear.